The smell of burnt ozone and expensive cologne is something I can still taste. Even now, I was sitting in my Tribeca office, staring at a progress bar that refused to move, while my fingers shook so hard I could barely hit the keys. I had exactly 6 minutes before the FBI breached the lobby, and 84% of my life was still sitting on a hard drive I wasn't supposed to have. Then my desk phone started clicking. Not a ring. A rhythmic, metallic tap, like a heart beating inside the plastic. That's when I realized the man I'd worked for 10 years wasn't just watching me, he was hunting me. I thought I was stealing $50 million. I didn't know I was actually signing my own death warrant for a company that didn't even exist. I had one chance to move those files or lose everything, including my breath. Let me take you back to where this began. Arthur Sterling sat in his Tribeca office, the silence of the room amplified by the low, predatory hum of his workstation. Outside the floor-to-ceiling glass, the Manhattan skyline was a jagged crown of steel and light. But Arthur saw only his own reflection, a man in a charcoal suit that cost more than his father had earned in a year. His fingers, steady but cold, flew across the keys. He wasn't typing a report. He was performing a digital exorcism. On the secondary monitor, a series of progress bars flickered like dying pulses. He was scrubbing the remnants of the tech merger data he had siphoned over the last 3 weeks. A trail of breadcrumbs that led directly to a Chicago-based recruiter named Marcus Thorne. The air in the office smelled faintly of ozone and expensive sandalwood, a scent designed to calm high-net-worth clients. But it felt cloying today, like the perfume in a funeral parlor. A sharp, rhythmic chirping erupted from his desk drawer. Arthur didn't flinch, but his jaw tightened until his teeth ached. He pulled out a slender, unbranded handset. It was a secure line, one he only shared with Michael Davis, a junior analyst who possessed a brilliant mind and a crippling habit of apologizing to furniture. "Arthur, stop whatever you're doing." Michael's voice crackled, stripped of its usual stutter. "IT just triggered a level 4 sweep. Jennifer Martinez is in the server room. She's humming that funeral song again. They're hitting the executive floor in less than 10 minutes. Arthur looked at the screen. The purge was at 82%. "How much of a window do I have?" "None," Michael whispered, the sound of a rolling chair squeaking in the background. "If your digital signature is still active when the sweep hits the firewall, it'll be like a flare in a dark forest. They'll see everything. Get out, Arthur. Just get out." Arthur disconnected. He didn't panic. He simply accelerated. He bypassed the standard exit protocols, a move that felt like jumping from a moving car, and yanked the hardware key from the port. The metal bit into his palm, searing hot from the data transfer. He stood up, adjusted his cufflinks until they were perfectly parallel to his sleeves. Rotation ritual number 4, and grabbed his coat. As he stepped into the hallway, the carpet muffled his footsteps. But the frantic drumming of his heart felt loud enough to trigger the building's acoustic sensors. The elevator ride down to the parking garage felt like an eternity spent in a brass-lined coffin. Arthur watched the floor numbers descend, his mind already pivoting to the next phase. He had a handoff scheduled in Lower Manhattan with Thorne's courier. The interview, as Thorne called it, was moving into its final stage. If Arthur delivered the drive, the $50 million parachute was his. He stepped into the garage, the air thick with the smell of damp concrete and exhaust. His silver sedan sat under a flickering fluorescent light. He climbed in, the leather cool against his back, and pulled out into the street. Lower Manhattan was a labyrinth of shadows and glass. As Arthur navigated the narrow corridors of the financial district, He kept his eyes on the rearview mirror. The city felt different tonight. Heavier, more observant. The skyscrapers were 1,000 dark mirrors, tracking his progress. He was 3 blocks from the meeting point when he noticed the headlights. A black SUV, windows tinted to avoid, had been trailing him since Chambers Street. It didn't keep a polite distance. It hovered on his bumper like a predatory shark. Arthur accelerated, his grip tightening on the steering wheel. The SUV matched his speed. Suddenly, the black beast lunged. It swerved to the left, attempting to PIT maneuver Arthur's sedan into a row of parked cars. Arthur slammed on the brakes, the scent of burning rubber filling the cabin as his car lurched. The SUV roared past, then swung sideways, trying to block the narrow street. This makes sense, Arthur thought, his mind racing with cold logic. Thorne is testing me. He wants to see if I can handle the pressure, or perhaps he's ensuring I wasn't followed. This is a professional handoff. High stakes require high security. He felt a surge of adrenaline, a confidence spark. He was playing the game at the highest level now. He shifted into reverse, tires shrieking against the asphalt, and spun the car in a tight arc. He found a gap between the SUV and a delivery truck and floored it. The SUV gave chase, but Arthur knew these streets better than any GPS. He ducked into a service alley, the brick walls closing in until he could hear the wind whistling through his side mirrors. He emerged onto a side street and saw the courier, a man in a nondescript gray hoodie standing under a deactivated security camera. Arthur pulled over, his chest heaving. The SUV was nowhere to be seen. He had won. He had proven his worth. He stepped out of the car, the humid New York air sticking to his skin. "You're late," the courier said, his voice flat. Arthur reached into his pocket and pulled out the drive. Traffic was heavy. He handed it over, a sense of immense relief washing through him. The weight of the last month seemed to lift from his shoulders. He had done it. He had moved the piece across the board. The courier took the drive, but he didn't leave. He looked past Arthur, his eyes widening. Arthur turned. The black SUV hadn't disappeared. It had circled around. It didn't slow down this time. It accelerated, the engine a guttural roar that vibrated through Arthur's ribcage. "Wait!" Arthur shouted, thinking there was some mistake. The SUV didn't stop. It slammed into the side of Arthur's parked sedan with a bone-jarring crunch of metal and glass. The impact sent Arthur sprawling onto the wet pavement. He watched in horror as the courier, the man he had just trusted with his future, didn't run away. Instead, the courier walked over to the SUV. The passenger door opened, and he hopped inside. As the vehicle sped away, Arthur lay on the ground, the smell of leaking coolant and scorched dust filling his nostrils. He realized with a sickening jolt that the drive he had handed over wasn't the dummy drive he'd prepared as a backup. In his haste, in his misplaced confidence during the chase, he had handed over the primary drive, the one containing the actual stolen data. He wasn't being tested, he was being robbed. And he had just handed the thieves the keys to his kingdom. Arthur sat on a rusted park bench in a small, forgotten square 3 blocks away, his suit jacket torn at the shoulder. The silence was broken only by the distant, rhythmic clatter of a subway train beneath the grates. His phone buzzed. It was Michael. "I'm at the secondary spot," Michael whispered. "The coffee shop on 4th. Where are you?" "I'm coming," Arthur said, his voice sounding hollow to his own ears. When he reached the shop, Michael was huddled in a corner booth, staring at a laptop screen. He looked up as Arthur approached, his bloodshot eyes darting to the tear in Arthur's coat. "Sorry," Michael said automatically, apologizing for the world's cruelty. "Arthur, I found something. While I was scrubbing your local cache, I ran a sweep for physical signals. I found a bug in your office, hidden inside the base of the mahogany desk." Arthur sat down, his mind still reeling from the SUV. "Vance's people?" Michael shook his head, his fingers trembling as he tapped the keys. "No, that's the problem. I pulled the serial signature. It's military grade. High-frequency burst transmission. This isn't corporate espionage, Arthur. This is government-level surveillance, the kind the FBI uses when they're building a RICO case." The air in the coffee shop suddenly felt freezing. Arthur looked at his hands. He was still wearing the same shirt, rotation ritual violated. He felt exposed, stripped bare. The corporate game had just turned into a federal hunt, and he was the fox. The next morning, the sun rose over Manhattan like a cold, indifferent eye. Arthur was back in his office, his movements mechanical. He had changed into a fresh white shirt, number 12 in the rotation. But the fabric felt like sandpaper against his skin. The encrypted handset on his desk vibrated. "Arthur?" Marcus Thorne's voice was like expensive scotch, smooth and dangerous. Over the line, Arthur heard a rhythmic sequence. Pop, pop, pop. Thorne was cracking his knuckles. "The drive you provided was illuminating, but incomplete. You held back the California Tech merger files, the crown jewels." Arthur leaned back, trying to regain his footing. "I keep leverage until the contract is signed, Marcus. That's the protocol." "The protocol has changed," Thorne said, his voice dropping an octave. "The board in Chicago is losing patience. You have 6 hours to upload the California files to the secure drop. If the files aren't there by 4 p.m., the $50 million parachute vanishes. And Arthur, we'll make sure Robert Vance finds out exactly who has been bleeding his firm dry. You'll be lucky if you end up in a cell instead of the Hudson." The line went dead. Arthur stared at the wall. 6 hours. He needed a distraction, something to pull IT's eyes away from the vault long enough for him to slip in and take the physical backup tapes. He moved to his terminal. He began writing a script designed to mimic a catastrophic hardware failure in the primary cooling system. It was a simple, elegant plan. The servers would report a heat spike, the alarms would trigger, and Jennifer Martinez would be too busy preventing a literal meltdown to notice a small data dip in the California archives. He was seconds away from hitting execute when the office door swung open. Robert Vance stood in the threshold. He didn't speak. He simply stared, his silver hair gleaming under the LED lights. He began his ritual, his eyes tracing the ceiling tiles. Arthur held his breath, counting with him in the silence. 1, 2, 3. Vance reached a prime number and lowered his gaze. "Emergency board meeting, now. Conference room A." "Robert, I'm in the middle of the quarterly projections." "Now," Vance repeated, his voice like grinding stones. "The building is on lockdown. Security Protocol Alpha. No one enters, no one leaves until I say so." Vance turned and walked away, his heavy, rhythmic gait echoing in the hall. Arthur looked at his screen. The server crash script was ready, but if he executed it now, he'd be trapped in a locked building with a dozen suspicious executives and a very angry IT director. He closed the laptop. He had no choice. He followed Vance toward the conference room, feeling the walls of the firm closing in on him like the jaws of a trap. The board meeting was a theater of tension. The air in the room was a bone-dry 64 degrees, and Arthur's fingers felt numb as he shuffled his papers. Across the table, Rebecca Thompson was frantically picking at her cuticles, the audible crinkle-crinkle of sugar packets in her pocket providing a jagged soundtrack to the silence. Vance sat at the head of the table, his unblinking eyes fixed on Arthur. "There is a leak," Vance said, the words falling like lead weights. "A small, persistent drip. Someone is selling our future." Arthur maintained his clinical mask. "The metrics don't show a deficit, Robert." "Metrics lie," Vance growled. "People lie. But the Foundation never forgets." The meeting dragged on for 3 hours. Every time Arthur tried to excuse himself, Vance would launch into another monologue about loyalty and the weight of the stone. During a brief recess, Arthur slipped into the executive lounge to splash cold water on his face. The room was dim, the only light coming from the glowing hum of a wine fridge. A shadow moved in the corner. "You think you're so clean, don't you?" Arthur spun around. Sarah Johnson stood there, her posture slumped, her eyes wild. She was holding a paring knife she'd taken from the catering tray. Her thumb was rubbing the jagged scar on her chin. "Sarah, put that down," Arthur said, his voice calm but his heart hammering. "You fired me to cover your tracks," she hissed, her voice a ragged edge. "My husband died for this company, and you tossed me out like a used filter. Milk, eggs, light bulbs, detergent," she muttered, the Monday list spilling out like a curse. She lunged. Arthur stepped aside, the blade whistling past his ribs. He grabbed her wrist, the bone feeling fragile beneath his grip. They tumbled to the floor, the smell of her unwashed hair and rotting lilies filling his senses. Sarah fought with the strength of the truly broken, clawing at his face, her fingernails digging into his skin. Arthur managed to twist her arm behind her back, the knife clattering onto the hardwood. He pinned her down, his breath coming in jagged gasps. "I didn't fire you, Sarah." He lied, his voice a low hiss. "Vance did. He's the one who killed your husband's memory, not me." He pushed her away and stood up, straightening his tie. Sarah lay on the floor, sobbing the names of grocery items into the carpet. Arthur didn't help her up. He didn't have time for pity. He had 2 hours left on Thorne's clock. He returned to his office, his mind a whirlwind of static. He needed to verify Thorne's credentials. Something Michael had said about the military-grade bug was gnawing at him. He opened a private browser and began digging into the Chicago firm Thorne claimed to represent. He tracked the corporate registration, peeling back the layers of shell companies and offshore holdings. He reached the final layer, the physical address of the headquarters. He pulled up a satellite view of the coordinates. The screen showed a vacant lot, a patch of scorched earth and weeds in a dilapidated industrial district. It had been empty for over a decade. Arthur felt a cold prickle dance across his skin. Marcus Thorne didn't exist. The Chicago firm didn't exist. He was being played by a ghost. But who was the puppeteer? He looked at the clock. 3:15 p.m. Despite the mounting evidence of a setup, the primitive fear of lack, the ghost of the boy who wore the same stained shirt for 3 days, took control. If he didn't deliver the files, he had nothing. If he delivered them, he might at least have the money to disappear. He decided to proceed. He would infiltrate the high-security file room during the board's dinner break. It was the only way. The dinner break arrived at 5 p.m. The executives filtered out toward the catering hall, their voices a low murmur of greed and exhaustion. Arthur hung back, waiting until the corridor was empty. He made his move. He navigated the stairwell, his boots clicking like a metronome on the concrete. He reached the vault door, a slab of reinforced steel that required a biometric scan and a physical key. He pulled out a small device Michael had built for him, a digital bypass that mimicked the thermal signature of a human thumb. He pressed it to the sensor. The light turned green. A soft thunk echoed through the hall as the bolts retracted. Arthur stepped inside. The air was frigid. The high-pitched whine of the servers a piercing electronic scream that made his teeth ache. He found the California merger drive, its blue light pulsing rhythmically. He connected his portable deck and began the download. Phase 1. Smart decision. Arthur felt a surge of professional pride. He had bypassed the most sophisticated security system in the city. He was outsmarting Vance, outsmarting the ghost of Thorne, and securing his future. He watched the progress bar. This time, it was fast. The files were sliding into his possession like silk. Phase 2. False positive. The transfer reached 100%. Arthur yanked the drive and tucked it into his briefcase. He felt a wave of genuine relief. He had the leverage. He could negotiate his way out of any trap now. He even allowed himself a small smile. He was the master of the system. Phase 3. The crack. He turned to leave, but stopped at the threshold. Something was wrong. The server whine had changed pitch. It wasn't a steady scream anymore. It was a series of rhythmic chirps. Chirp, chirp, chirp. It sounded exactly like the clicking on his secure phone line. Arthur looked back at the server rack. A small red light was blinking on the primary console. A light that shouldn't be there. Phase 4. Full collapse. Suddenly, every monitor in the room flared to life. They didn't show data. They showed his face. High-definition footage of him entering the vault, using the bypass, and stealing the drive. Then, the text appeared, scrolling across every screen in the building. Access granted. Arthur Sterling. File transfer complete. Notifying authorities. It was a canary trap. The files weren't the crown jewels. They were a digital tag, a beacon that broadcasted his login credentials and his physical location to every terminal in the firm. The emergency sirens erupted, a deafening two-tone wail that vibrated through the floorboards. Arthur lunged for the door, but the steel shutters slammed shut with the force of a guillotine. He was trapped. He scrambled to his laptop, trying to kill the signal, but the screen was frozen. A new message appeared. Thank you for your contribution, Arthur. The foundation is now secure. Arthur slumped against the cold steel of the vault door. He had spent his life trying to be the most powerful person in the room, only to realize he had been the only one who didn't know the room was a cage. The sirens continued to wail, a funeral dirge for a career that was already dead. Arthur was eventually rescued from the vault by a team of private security guards, men with thick necks and eyes like stones. They didn't read him his rights. They didn't take him to a police station. They took him to the Pierre Hotel. The penthouse was a cathedral of old money, all gold leaf ceilings and heavy velvet drapes that felt like they were slowly lowering to crush him. The smell of rotting lilies was back, cloying and sweet. Sit, one of the guards commanded, gesturing to a high-backed leather chair. Arthur sat. He pulled out his personal phone, his hands shaking. He needed to see the damage. He logged into his offshore accounts, the ones he had spent years building with consulting fees and performance bonuses. Balance, $0. He checked his personal savings. Balance, $0. Thorne, or whoever Thorne was, hadn't just trapped him, they had drained him. He was a man with no resources, no identity, and a reputation that was currently being broadcast to the FBI as a corporate thief. The chair at the far end of the room turned. It wasn't Marcus Thorne. Robert Vance sat there, a glass of scotch in his hand. He looked at Arthur not with anger, but with a terrifying clinical curiosity. The triple pop, Vance said, and then he cracked his knuckles. Pop, pop, pop. A nice touch, don't you think? It gave the persona a certain nervous energy, made him feel real. Arthur felt the world tilt. You? Thorne was you? Thorne was a voice actor from the village, Vance said, taking a slow sip of his drink. The SUV, the chase, the bug in your office, all theater. I needed to know if you were granite, Arthur, or if you were just sand. You ruined me, Arthur whispered, his voice cracking. For a test? I didn't ruin you, Vance said, standing up. He walked over to the window, looking out at the city he helped build. Your greed ruined you. I gave you every opportunity to be loyal. I gave you the keys to the kingdom, and the first thing you did was try to change the locks. Vance turned back, his eyes unblinking. The FBI investigation is real, by the way. But they aren't looking for a leak. They're looking for you. I've handed them everything. The footage, the drive, the digital trail you thought you scrubbed. Why let me go to the hotel? Arthur asked, his heart a cold stone in his chest. Because I wanted you to see the view from the top one last time, Vance said. Before you disappear into the shadows where you belong. You're free to walk out that door, Arthur. I won't stop you. But you have no money, no phone, and no name. You are a ghost in a cheap suit. Arthur stood up. He looked at his reflection in the polished mahogany table. He looked perfect. His hair was in place. His cufflinks were parallel. His shirt was white. But inside, he was empty. He walked out of the penthouse, through the gold leaf lobby, and out into the cold New York rain. He didn't have a coat. He didn't have an umbrella. He stood on the sidewalk, watching the distant lights of his former office. He realized then that he had spent his whole life running away from the trash he came from, only to build a mountain of garbage and call it a throne. He turned away from the light and began to walk, his footsteps lost in the rhythmic drumming of the rain against the pavement. He was just another shadow in a city of 8 million, a man who had finally learned that in the game of power, the only way to win is to realize that the pieces are never yours to keep. The city hummed around him, a low subterranean thrumming that rattled his ribs. The billboards in Times Square flickered, their light reflecting in the puddles at his feet. Arthur Sterling, the man who never wore the same shirt twice, disappeared into the gray, humid mist of the night, leaving nothing behind but the scent of scorched dust and the echo of a siren that wouldn't stop screaming. The end.